Bear Radio.
I remember the gunshots. I was actually very close by to Tiananmen Square when it happened. I was literally 2 blocks away. My memory is a bit of a blank between the ages of 10 and 20. I don't think I would have done well if I wasn't able to block certain things off,
The third culture is what emerges at the intersection between your culture of origin and the other cultures that have shaped you. This show is a place for us to explore how our futures are actually led by what happened to us in the past, and how we know who we are and where we belong when our points of reference keep changing. These are more than conversations about Asian identity. They're portraits of whole people, what keeps them up at night, what their hearts long for, and the impact they hope to have on their communities. I'm your host, Sen Jan, a third culture kid born in China, raised in Canada, and currently based in Berlin. This series is a first step towards making peace with my own struggles as a third culture Asian, and it's my hope that anyone who's ever felt confused about who they are and where they belong will hear themselves reflected in our stories. The Tiananmen Square Massacres of 1989, a fractured childhood with memory loss, and recovering from the trauma of immigration. In episode 9, Julian, the only Chinese-speaking psychiatrist in a large Canadian city, weighs in on how the clashing of Western ideals with the Confucian philosophy is at the heart of mental health issues amongst Asian immigrants and their families.
Because Chinese families are enmeshed from the Western point of view, we walk into the world, we really are reflections of our parents, much more than in the Western culture.
A shout out to our first round of patrons, Danya, Sri, Fanny, and Ina. Having you with us gives such a boost, and I'm so grateful for your support, and I'm excited to provide you with your membership perks. Visit patreon.com/BeyondAsian to become a patron for as little as $4 a month. You'll get access to exclusive member-only content, and you'll be helping to keep our lights on. With tiers from mochi to boba to hot pot, there's a membership level for whatever amount you're able to contribute, and I promise you every little bit counts. Now, on with the show. Julian, welcome to the Beyond Asian podcast. Thank you for making time away from parental care to be with me today.
Thank you so much, Sen. It's a great pleasure.
I have been really looking forward to our interview, not only because we've known each other for almost 20 years now, maybe even more. I'm trying to remember.
It's astonishingly long time, for sure.
Yeah. And one of the best things about getting older, there's so many nice things about getting older, but one of the best things about getting older is being able to kind of drop these years to say things like, oh, I've known this person for 20 years. Oh, yeah. 2 decades ago, we were hanging out in university.
That's right.
Julian and I met each other way back in our university years. I was a lost first-year general sciences student, and he was a second-year biology student. While I'd like to be able to say that Julian and I simply had a natural affinity for each other, the truth is, it was all about the bagels. Every Tuesday, the Biology Students Association bought freshly baked bagels for its student body. I wasn't a biology student, but I passed through their lounge in the mornings after my early-ass 8:30 a.m. classes. One morning, I ducked my head in to see if there might be some extra bagels lying around. Julian was there. Not only was he okay with giving me, a non-bio student, a bagel, he offered me 2, with cream cheese. He was my friend from that moment on. I've been wanting to interview Julian for a long time. Having immigrated to Canada when he was 6 and under the guidance of his father, Julian grew up with a traditional Confucian education which afforded him a masterful understanding of Chinese history, culture, and language. But layered on top of this is also an extensive education in Western medicine and specifically in psychiatry. This makes him the perfect guest for this podcast. Today, Julian is one of the few Chinese-speaking psychiatrists in a large Canadian city. I realized that despite having known him for nearly 20 years, I've never asked Julian in detail about what his immigration story was and how it was for him to grow up with such strong foundations in both the Eastern and Western cultures, and just what happened to him before the time that we met.
I don't talk about it much.
Tell me a little bit about just how all of that was for you, what you can remember from it.
So it's very unusual, right? I mean, it was a horrible period of history for China. So my dad and my mom, obviously, went through the Cultural Revolution, so 66 to 76. So my dad was 16 in 1970. So that's when the revolution caught him. I think, the revolution catches up with people at different points.
The Cultural Revolution in China, one of the most cataclysmic events in the history of the Asian continent. Spanning a decade from 1966 to 1976, this movement purged Chinese society of the remnants of its traditional and capitalist elements and replaced them with its signature communism with Chinese characteristics. The massive restructuring of Chinese society brought about by the Cultural Revolution, including sending masses of city dwellers to the countryside as laborers to re-educate them in Maoist ideologies. Many young, college-age people were forced to work for several years in the countryside, often foregoing higher education, as well as incurring severe health risks from poor living conditions. Mao has been quoted as saying, "The intellectual youth must go to the country and will be educated from living in rural poverty." My own father was sent to the countryside for 2 years after high school. He was one of the few from this village who returned to the city afterwards and pursued a college education. It turns out that Julian's parents had a similar trajectory.
So at 16, my dad was sent to the countryside. And so that's how he met my mom. My mom was from the village, right? And he was there for 7 years planting rice right to the very end of the revolution, till Mao's death, 76. And so he was 23. My dad is from a highly educated family. And then, so he knew English. So my grandfather, of all people, studied at the University of Illinois, did his master's and everything there. And so my grandfather taught my dad English from a very early age.
It was exceptionally unusual for a Chinese citizen to have received an education abroad during this time. Julian's grandfather being educated in the States meant that Julian's father would also have received some of this rare knowledge from the West and subsequently passed it on to Julian as a child in China, priming him to receive further Western ideas later on. But of course, at that time, no one could imagine exactly how this would come to pass.
So it was during that time that Tiananmen Square happened. Students dying, all the rest of it.
The massacre of Tiananmen Square on June 4th, 1989, a tragic event that put China on the front page of international media. Student protests had been held in the weeks prior. They were demonstrating for political reform, demanding greater freedom and openness to democracy, more accountability and transparency from government officials, and greater funding for education. The unrest disturbed the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the government called for military action to silence it. Soldiers in armored tanks rolled down the main road leading up to Tiananmen Square with the instructions to use deadly force. This is where the iconic picture of Tank Man comes from. A lone university student heading off a queue of tanks. Even as the tanks loomed ominously forward, turrets pointed directly at him, they still tried to steer their way around him so as to not crush him. The student shuffles left, then right to place himself squarely in the path of the lead tank. It's a tense moment, but also a heartbreaking one. The terror of the military turning on its own citizens and the perceptible internal conflict of countrymen against countrymen. The casualties from the massacre can only be approximated. Previous figures place the death toll at 1,000, but newer estimates place the true number of people killed during the crackdown at 10,000, with many more thousands wounded. The massacre, while broadcast to the rest of the world, was erased from Chinese history books. Like other totalitarian regimes, revising and deleting inconvenient truths came with the party. The Tiananmen Square massacres to this day are, with great care, omitted from the educational system, and violations are treated as heavy offenses. Those entering China as international teachers can sometimes be contractually obligated to keep quiet from talking about the brutal event. For many who have lived through this time, the Tiananmen Square massacres are like the ghost of a giant elephant in the room.
It's a very astonishing event because I was actually very close by to Tiananmen Square when it happened. I was literally 2 blocks away.
Oh, were you?
Yeah,
oh my goodness.
I remember the gunshots, and I remember clearly being very, very puzzled because school was out, and in China, school is never out, right? School is out, and I was hearing these popping sounds on the streets that I thought were fireworks. So I remember very, very clearly asking my grandma, like, how come? What's going on? There's fireworks on the street. It must be a holiday. And I'm not going to school.
Right.
And the memory got imprinted onto me because for the next 2 days, 3 days, I think it was longer than that, my grandmother never left the house, did not leave the house. And I mean, back in China those days, we had no fridge. So if you didn't leave the house to buy fresh food, there was no food. So a few things imprint memory better than hunger. So we had very little to eat for 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember that. But that same event, which caught me up in that moment, allowed my dad to come to Canada. So Canada was under the Mulroney government at that point. And it astonishingly offered some sort of an amnesty. I'm not quite sure on the details, but it offered some sort of amnesty to any Chinese person who could leave China at that point. A very different world back then than right now.
Hearing Julian say this was a clarifying moment for me. When the massacre happened, my father was a student abroad in Canada on a year of exchange. He was scheduled to return to China, where my mother and I were waiting for him. But following this brutal and bloody statement from the Chinese government as to the extent it was willing to go to maintain control over its citizens, my father decided that Canada was a safer and better place to raise his family, and he sponsored us to join him in Calgary. We were fortunate to have been welcomed by Canada with open arms, along with a wave of Chinese immigrants who were also able to leave when we did. To this day, I still see immigrating to Canada and eventually becoming a Canadian citizen as the single most important event in shaping the course of my life. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't come with its own set of long-reaching consequences.
Chinese people in that period who came to Canada are very rare. In the early 90s, the big wave of immigration didn't happen until much later, you know? So you're very right. We belong to a very rare cohort of immigrants. And most of us in this very unusual cohort came out because of Tiananmen Square, June the 4th incident. So but you have to imagine such a different time. Eh? The conversation around refugees is so different back then. The Canada was founded an honor, that it was a privilege to be able to bring people here. That was the conversation around it. It was very different about the conversation about refugees these days. Mulroney was a conservative government, but you can't even see a liberal government doing anything like that these days.
Well, the circumstances of Canada were different then as well, because they still needed to grow their population. So they were happy to
Absolutely.
welcome immigrants, especially if they were educated.
That's also absolutely true. But this one was more of a blanket sort of a thing, that if you could get out of China at that point, that Canada was going to take you, which I'm always grateful for.
Yeah, me too. Me too. The shock of immigration. As Julian explains, the global outrage at the atrocity of a government using its military to quell its own protesting citizens became the vehicle through which a wave of diasporic emigres left China to seek better lives in distant lands. Immigration under these conditions isn't exactly ideal. Many left without a clue as to what they were going to do in the new country and without speaking the language of the land. Those of us who came at a young enough age assimilated quickly into the dominant society, or at least more quickly than our parents could. Nevertheless, especially for younger children, the fracturing process of being uprooted from everything you've ever known and suddenly presented with a new reality that you just had to adjust to is nothing short of traumatizing, with a host of potential consequences.
And so in Canada, I have to say the first few years actually weren't bad. Then it just got worse. And there's a reason I don't talk much about that period until my university, because my memory is a bit of a blank. My memory is a bit of a blank between the ages of 10 and 20, probably.
Wow.
And I have tremendous difficulty linking events or remembering anything. In fact, we moved a lot. We moved about every 2 years for cheaper apartments and whatever. And I cannot remember the interiors of any of those apartments. And in fact, I cannot remember the order of when we lived where. So there was a place that I thought we lived in when I was very young. But when I finally matched up my story with my parents, that was actually I lived there in my late teens. And in fact, the last place that I lived in, my wife now, Julian, has a much better memory of what it looked like inside than I did. So I have very little recollection.
What do you think is the cause of that?
I think I was very stressed out for a lot of years. Not a little bit stressed out, like quite stressed out. And so that's one of the effects of trauma, is that trauma scrambles time. You can be quite old, but when trauma hits you, you feel like a kid. And then the memory gets encoded as a kid memory, but not as adult memory, you know? But the fact of it was that my dad did very poorly after he came to Canada. He didn't really work very hard at finding a job. And I think clinically, he was probably very depressed now that I know that these days. But his depression came out in a form of, unfortunately, a significant anger.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of conflicts at home. And so he never found proper employment until our financial circumstances more or less forced us to open